The people who change your life rarely arrive looking like heroes. The storm had swallowed half of Manhattan before the evening rush was over. Rain hammered against glass towers, rolled across flooded sidewalks, and blurred every traffic light into streaks of red and gold. Emma Reynolds hurried beneath the weak shelter of a bus stop, clutching the lapels of her worn navy coat while icy wind cut through every layer she wore. Her shift at the Children's Rehabilitation Clinic had ended almost an hour late after staying behind with a frightened little boy whose panic attacks always became worse during thunderstorms. She had missed the last express train and now faced nearly a mile of walking through weather that made the entire city feel abandoned. Most people rushed from doorway to doorway with their heads lowered, pretending not to notice anyone else. That was New York's unwritten rule. Survival came first. Compassion came later if there was any left. Emma had almost convinced herself to keep walking when she noticed someone sitting alone beneath the broken awning of an old bookstore across the street. At first she assumed it was another homeless man trying to wait out the rain. Then lightning illuminated him for half a second. His expensive charcoal suit was soaked through. One sleeve was torn near the wrist. His dark hair clung to his forehead while rainwater dripped steadily from his jaw. He wasn't asking anyone for help. He simply sat there with one shoulder resting against the brick wall, as if standing required more strength than he still possessed. Pedestrians walked past without slowing down. A taxi splashed dirty water across the curb only a few feet away. No one stopped. Emma watched him longer than she intended. Something about the quiet dignity in the stranger's posture unsettled her. He never called for help, never waved anyone over, never even looked up. He simply endured the storm. Her phone vibrated with another weather alert warning residents to remain indoors because flash flooding had reached several neighborhoods. She should have listened. Instead, she crossed the street. The cold rain soaked through her shoes before she reached the bookstore. Up close, the man looked younger than she first imagined. Early 30s, perhaps. Pale skin, strong features. A faint scrape near his temple where rain mixed with a thin line of drying blood that looked older than the storm itself. His breathing remained steady but slower than normal. His eyes stayed closed until he sensed someone standing nearby. They opened without surprise. Calm grey eyes studied her for only a second before shifting toward the street again. There was no fear inside them, no gratitude either. Only exhaustion carefully hidden behind discipline. "You're going to freeze out here." The stranger gave the smallest shake of his head. "I'll be fine." His voice sounded controlled despite the cold. American, deep, measured, almost detached. Emma glanced around. Every nearby cafe had already locked its doors because of the storm warning. Emergency sirens echoed somewhere several blocks away. She knew she should leave before the weather became worse. Instead, she slowly removed her own coat. The freezing wind immediately reached through her sweater, raising goosebumps along both arms. Without asking permission, she draped the coat across the stranger's shoulders. He looked genuinely surprised for the first time. "You need this more than I do," he said quietly, beginning to remove it. She gently stopped him. "I live close enough to run the rest of the way." It was a lie. Home was still almost 20 minutes away on foot. Their eyes met only briefly. Something passed between them that neither could explain. Not romance, not trust. Simply recognition that kindness still existed in a city determined to erase it. A black SUV rolled slowly past the intersection before disappearing around the corner without stopping. Emma never noticed it. The stranger did. Somewhere less than a mile away, several men searched every flooded street with increasing urgency, unaware that the person they were trying to find had already been found by someone who had no idea who he truly was. Emma smiled politely, almost embarrassed by her own decision. "Just promise you'll get somewhere warm." The stranger looked down at the coat wrapped around his shoulders. Inside one pocket, her employee identification badge had slipped loose from its clip during the walk home. Rain had washed enough dirt away for the plastic sleeve to catch the reflection of a passing streetlight. He saw the photograph, he saw the hospital logo. Most importantly, he saw her name, Emma Reynolds. He read it once, then again, carefully, as though committing every letter to memory. When he finally looked up, she was already jogging back into the curtain of rain, disappearing between passing headlights and swirling mist before he could say another word. What Emma didn't know was that some people spent their entire lives trying to remain invisible to powerful men. Unfortunately for her, the most dangerous man in the city had just memorized her name, and by sunrise, he intended to find the woman who had walked into a storm carrying nothing but kindness. Emma Reynolds woke before sunrise because the apartment radiator had decided to lose another battle with the New York winter. The tiny studio felt colder than the sidewalk outside. She wrapped herself in an old grey sweater, brewed the cheapest coffee she could find, and stood beside the narrow kitchen window watching rainwater still drip from fire escapes across the neighboring buildings. The storm had moved east overnight, leaving behind washed streets, broken tree branches, and a city pretending nothing unusual had happened. She tried not to think about the stranger beneath the bookstore awning. She told herself he had probably reached home safely, that someone with a suit like his surely had resources she could not imagine. Still, she noticed the empty coat hook beside the front door every time she looked up. It felt strangely personal to lose something so ordinary to someone whose name she never learned. By 8 o'clock, the rehabilitation clinic had already filled with nervous parents and restless children. The waiting room smelled of crayons, disinfectant and fresh coffee. It was familiar, comforting, predictable. Emma preferred predictable. She spent the morning helping a little girl regain confidence after a leg, celebrating every small victory, as though each careful step deserved its own standing ovation. Moments like that reminded her why she stayed despite the exhausting hours and modest paycheck. Kindness did not always solve problems, but sometimes it gave people enough strength to face another day. Around lunchtime, approached carrying a large white box wrapped with a dark blue ribbon. "Delivery for you," she said, sounding more confused than excited. Emma frowned. "Are you sure?" The label clearly displayed her full name in elegant handwriting. There was no company logo, no return address, only 3 carefully written words. "Thank you, Emma." Every nurse nearby gathered closer as curiosity spread through the office. Emma slowly untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside rested her navy coat, perfectly cleaned and carefully pressed. Even the loose button she had planned to sew back on next weekend had somehow been replaced with an identical one. Folded neatly across the collar lay a thick wool scarf the color of midnight, soft enough to belong in an expensive department store rather than her modest apartment. Beneath it rested a handwritten note. "You should not have walked home in the cold without this. Thank you for reminding me that decency still exists." There was no signature. Emma read the message twice before quietly folding it into her pocket. Her co-workers immediately began guessing who could have sent such an unexpected gift. A secret admirer, a grateful patient's family, maybe someone from the hospital fundraiser last month. Emma smiled politely but offered no theories. Deep down, she already suspected the answer. The stranger had found her. She simply could not understand how. Less than a mile away, inside the top floor of a private office overlooking the Hudson River, Luca Moretti stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows watching helicopters circle above morning traffic. His jacket had finally dried. Emma's coat rested neatly across the back of a leather chair instead of remaining locked inside evidence storage or discarded by security, as every advisor had recommended. One of his oldest associates entered quietly carrying a folder. "We confirmed everything. She has worked at the clinic for 4 years. No criminal record. Volunteers twice a month at a community shelter. Lives alone." Luca never opened the folder. "Enough." The older man hesitated. "Do you want surveillance to continue?" Luca answered without turning around. "No. She deserves her privacy." The reply surprised everyone in the room. They were accustomed to precise instructions, careful planning, and emotional distance. This decision belonged to none of those categories. Luca simply continued watching sunlight slowly break through clouds that had dominated the skyline only hours earlier. He remembered the freezing weight of the borrowed coat settling across his shoulders and the way she had walked away before expecting anything in return. People usually wanted favors, influence, protection. She had wanted nothing. Back at the clinic, Emma finished her shift later than expected after comforting another frightened child through physical therapy. As evening settled over the city, she wrapped the new scarf around her neck before stepping outside. It was warmer than anything she had ever owned. She laughed softly at the realization that a stranger somehow knew she would refuse to spend money replacing her old winter clothes. She had barely reached the subway entrance when a little boy bumped into her while chasing a paper airplane. She picked it up, smiled, and handed it back. His grateful mother thanked her before disappearing into the crowd. Emma never noticed the black SUV waiting across the street. Its engine remained silent. Its windows stayed dark. It drove away only after she safely entered the station. What she still believed was a simple act of gratitude had already become something much larger inside a world she could not yet see, and somewhere beyond the maze of city lights, fate quietly prepared their next impossible meeting. 3 days passed before Emma Reynolds allowed herself to believe the mysterious encounter belonged in the past. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm of crowded subway platforms, long clinic hours, grocery lists calculated down to the last dollar, and evenings spent reading treatment plans beside the small lamp that barely lit her apartment. The elegant scarf remained wrapped around her neck every morning, warmer than anything she had ever owned. Yet every time she touched its soft fabric, she remembered the stranger's calm grey eyes and the note folded carefully inside her wallet. She never showed it to anyone. It felt oddly private, like a conversation that had happened without enough words. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and bright winter sunlight reflecting from rows of glass buildings. The clinic director asked Emma to deliver therapy materials to a children's outreach center across Midtown because another therapist had called in sick. She gladly accepted. The walk gave her a rare chance to enjoy fresh air instead of fluorescent lights. Street musicians filled the sidewalks with jazz melodies, while office workers hurried toward late lunches, carrying expensive coffee cups and speaking into wireless headsets. New York looked completely different when the weather cooperated. Emma balanced 2 supply bags while waiting at a crosswalk, smiling as several elementary school children laughed at pigeons gathering near a food cart. For a brief moment, the city felt almost gentle. Less than half a mile away, Luca Moretti stepped out of a quiet board meeting inside one of the tallest buildings overlooking the avenue. His advisors continued discussing contracts and financial reports behind him, but his attention shifted toward the window facing the busy intersection below. He recognized the navy scarf before he recognized the woman in it. She looked exactly the same as the night of the storm. Simple clothes, comfortable shoes, a careful smile offered freely to strangers she would never meet again. She had no idea that several luxury vehicles had just stopped because one man remained unexpectedly silent while watching the street below. An older associate noticed the direction of Luca's gaze. "Is something wrong?" Luca answered without looking away. "No. For once, something is exactly as it should be." Emma continued toward the outreach center, unaware that a black sedan had entered the avenue several blocks behind her. It was not following her specifically, at least not at first. The driver appeared distracted, circling the neighborhood twice before finally pulling closer to the curb near the community center entrance. Emma reached the front steps just as an elderly volunteer struggled with several heavy donation boxes. Without hesitation, she set down her own bags and hurried over to help. Together they carried everything safely inside, while exchanging cheerful conversation about the weekend reading program for neighborhood children. By the time Emma stepped back onto the sidewalk nearly 20 minutes later, the dark sedan had disappeared. She never gave it another thought. What she did notice was the familiar black SUV parked quietly across the street beside a row of winter trees. It looked strangely familiar, although she could not explain why. The tinted rear window slowly lowered only a few inches. She caught a glimpse of the same composed grey eyes watching the sidewalk. For one suspended heartbeat, the noise of the city seemed to disappear beneath the distant sound of traffic and fluttering flags above nearby buildings. Luca stepped out before any driver could stop him. His tailored charcoal overcoat moved gently in the cold breeze as he crossed the street with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to people making room without being asked. Emma remained where she stood, more curious than frightened. "Your coat served me well," he said with a faint smile. "I am glad it found its way home." She laughed softly. "It came back looking better than when I bought it. It deserved proper care." There was a quiet sincerity in his answer that surprised her. She studied him more carefully than she had during the storm. His posture remained perfectly composed. The scrape near his temple had nearly disappeared. He looked healthy now, although there was still something unreadable hidden behind the calm expression he wore so naturally. "I never thanked you for the scarf," she said. "You really did not have to do that." "Yes," he replied after a brief pause. "I did." Before she could answer, a little girl accidentally dropped a stack of coloring books while running out of the community center. Emma immediately knelt to help gather them. Luca did the same without hesitation. The child thanked them both before skipping happily back inside. Emma looked at him with quiet surprise. Powerful executives rarely knelt on cold sidewalks to pick up children's books. He simply handed her the last one without mentioning it. "I never asked your name," she said. Luca held her gaze for a second that somehow felt longer than it truly was. "Luca." He offered nothing more, no last name, no explanation. Somewhere nearby, one of his security officers discreetly touched an earpiece after noticing unfamiliar faces lingering at the opposite corner. Emma noticed only that Luca's attention briefly shifted toward the crowd before returning to her with the same controlled calm. She could not understand why such an ordinary conversation suddenly felt fragile, as though the city itself was waiting for something neither of them could yet see. Then Luca spoke one quiet sentence that lingered in the cold afternoon air long after the traffic lights changed. "I hope the next time we meet it will be under kinder skies." Saturday arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight that painted long shadows across Manhattan without offering much warmth. Emma Reynolds welcomed the rare day away from the clinic with a simple plan. She intended to return a stack of borrowed library books, buy groceries for the week, and spend the afternoon preparing lesson materials for several young patients who learned faster through games than traditional therapy. It was the kind of quiet routine she had built her entire adult life around. Predictable days felt like small victories. The memory of meeting Luca on the sidewalk lingered somewhere in the back of her mind, but she refused to romanticize coincidence. New York was filled with strangers crossing paths every hour. Some encounters simply stayed with people longer than others. The public library near Bryant Park buzzed with weekend visitors escaping the cold. Families wandered between shelves while college students searched for quiet corners to study. Emma returned her books, selected 2 new titles on childhood development, and settled briefly beside a tall window overlooking the park. Outside, children chased one another across patches of frozen grass, while street vendors sold roasted nuts and hot chocolate beneath colorful umbrellas. The ordinary beauty of the afternoon relaxed her in ways she had not realized she needed. Less than a mile away, Luca Moretti sat through another meeting that had already stretched beyond 2 hours. Financial reports covered the polished conference table, but his attention drifted whenever conversation became repetitive. An advisor quietly informed him that several community organizations had submitted funding requests for educational programs. Normally, another department handled those decisions. This time, Luca asked to see the applications himself. One folder immediately caught his attention: Children's Rehabilitation Outreach, Midtown, the same neighborhood where Emma volunteered earlier that week. He opened the proposal without commenting. There was no mention of Emma anywhere in the document, yet he found himself reading every page with unusual patience. One associate exchanged a puzzled glance with another, but wisely asked no questions. Later that afternoon, Emma left the library carrying a reusable grocery bag and the 2 books tucked beneath one arm. As she crossed Bryant Park, live music drifted through the crisp air from a small outdoor performance. She slowed long enough to listen. Nearby, a young violinist played with remarkable confidence despite the cold. Several people applauded before continuing on their way. Emma dropped a few folded bills into the open instrument case and smiled when the musician thanked her. She continued walking without noticing that another pair of eyes had witnessed the exchange from across the park. Luca had dismissed his driver for a few minutes, choosing to walk alone while clearing his thoughts. He recognized Emma almost immediately. Though she remained completely unaware of his presence, she stopped for strangers. She thanked cashiers by name. She smiled at children as though they were the most important people on the sidewalk. None of it appeared performed. It simply seemed natural. Unfortunately for her, she was no longer the only person paying attention. A well-dressed man standing near a coffee cart quietly watched Emma before making a brief phone call and disappearing into the afternoon crowd. Luca noticed him. The observation lasted only seconds, but years of disciplined instinct told him the man's interest had not been accidental. He did not approach Emma. He did not interrupt her peaceful afternoon. Instead, he spoke softly into a secure phone after returning to his vehicle. Find out why that man was watching her. There was no anger in his voice, only calm certainty. Emma finished shopping shortly before sunset and boarded a downtown subway train carrying 2 heavy grocery bags. The crowded car swayed gently through underground tunnels while passengers stared at phones or half-finished newspapers. At the next stop, an elderly woman entered using a cane. Emma immediately stood and offered her seat without hesitation. The woman accepted with grateful eyes. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman quietly observed the exchange before smiling to himself. Kindness seemed to follow Emma wherever she went, unnoticed by most people but impossible to ignore for those paying close attention. When she finally reached her apartment building, she found a small envelope tucked beneath her door. There was no stamp, no address. Only her name written in the same elegant handwriting she had seen before. Her heartbeat quickened as she carried it inside. The note contained only one sentence: "Please be careful walking home after dark this week." Emma read it twice beneath the warm glow of the kitchen light. There was still no signature, but she no longer needed one. She looked toward the window overlooking the quiet street below, unaware that somewhere beyond the evening traffic, questions were beginning to gather around her life for reasons she could not yet imagine, while the man who had promised himself to respect her privacy was discovering that keeping his distance might no longer be enough. Monday morning arrived beneath a pale grey sky that threatened another storm without ever delivering one. Emma Reynolds slipped the anonymous note into the same wallet pocket that already held the first message, telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation for everything. Perhaps Luca simply knew the neighborhood could become unsafe after dark. Perhaps he had noticed something she had missed. Even so, the warning lingered in her thoughts during the subway ride to work. Every unfamiliar face seemed to hold her attention a little longer than usual before she quietly reminded herself not to become paranoid. The rehabilitation clinic quickly swept away those worries. Children filled the therapy rooms with laughter, crayons rolled across colorful mats, and parents celebrated tiny milestones that meant everything inside those walls. Emma spent nearly an hour helping a young boy learn to balance confidently on his new leg braces. His smile after taking 5 careful steps without assistance felt more valuable than any paycheck she had ever received. Moments later, the clinic director called everyone into the conference room with unexpected excitement. A major anonymous donor had funded an entirely new pediatric therapy program. New equipment had already been ordered. Waiting lists would finally become shorter. Families who could not afford treatment would receive care at no additional cost. The room erupted with relieved applause. Emma smiled with everyone else, never imagining that somewhere across the city, the decision had been approved only hours earlier. Less than 2 miles away, Luca Moretti reviewed photographs of the renovated therapy rooms displayed across a conference table. His financial advisor explained projected costs, while another executive questioned whether the anonymous contribution should be announced publicly. Luca closed the folder before anyone finished speaking. "The recognition belongs to the people doing the work," he said calmly. "Not to the person writing the check," nobody argued. They had learned long ago that his quiet decisions rarely changed once made. As the meeting ended, the older associate who had first investigated Emma stepped closer. "We identified the man from Bryant Park." Luca remained silent, waiting. "He works for a private intelligence firm. The client has not been identified yet, but they have requested information on several non-profit organizations, including the clinic." Luca's expression did not change, although the room somehow felt colder. "Continue watching. Do not approach anyone unless absolutely necessary." The associate nodded once before leaving without another question. Back at the clinic, Emma volunteered to stay late because one therapist had become ill unexpectedly. By the time she locked the treatment room and stepped outside, the winter sun had already disappeared behind rows of office buildings. She remembered the warning tucked safely inside her wallet and decided to avoid the quieter shortcut she normally used. Instead, she followed the brighter avenue lined with restaurants, bookstores and evening commuters. The sidewalks remained busy enough to feel comfortable. Halfway home, she stopped at a neighborhood bakery, purchasing 2 discounted loaves of bread that would be donated to the church pantry the next morning before work. The elderly owner thanked her warmly, insisting she accept a small cinnamon roll that had been left unsold. Emma laughed and promised to enjoy it with coffee before her shift. As she walked toward the subway entrance carrying the paper bag, she noticed an elderly man struggling to gather groceries scattered across the sidewalk after one of the handles had broken. Several people hurried past without slowing down. Emma immediately knelt to help collect canned soup, apples, and a carton of milk before they rolled into the street. The grateful man smiled with watery eyes. "There are still good people in this city," he whispered. Emma simply wished him a safe evening before continuing toward the station. She never realized another pair of observant eyes had witnessed everything from inside a parked vehicle across the avenue. Luca had arrived only minutes earlier after finishing another meeting nearby. He watched as she disappeared into the station, carrying her own groceries while making certain someone else reached home safely first. His driver quietly broke the silence. "You could introduce yourself properly." Luca looked toward the crowded entrance where Emma had vanished. "Not yet." "Why?" the driver asked carefully. Luca answered after a long pause. "Because the moment she learns who I really am, every ordinary conversation between us becomes impossible." At that exact moment, several blocks away inside a quiet office overlooking the East River, A confidential report landed on an expensive wooden desk. The first page displayed a recent photograph of Emma Reynolds leaving the rehabilitation clinic. Beneath it appeared a single handwritten instruction: "Continue observing, do not make contact yet." The person reading the report slowly closed the folder, while somewhere beneath the endless glow of Manhattan's evening lights, Emma unknowingly stepped closer to a truth that would soon make every act of ordinary kindness feel anything but ordinary. Tuesday unfolded beneath a brilliant blue sky that almost erased the memory of last week's storm. Emma Reynolds arrived at the rehabilitation clinic carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, one for herself and one for the receptionist who always unlocked the front doors before sunrise. Small routines anchored her life. They reminded her that ordinary kindness still mattered, even inside a city that moved too quickly to notice it. The children arrived one by one, bundled in colorful winter coats, filling the hallway with laughter that echoed against bright painted walls. Emma spent the morning guiding a young girl through speech exercises using puppets and picture cards. Every new word earned applause. Every smile felt like proof that patience could accomplish what pressure never could. During lunch, the clinic director invited the staff into the newly renovated therapy room funded by the anonymous donor. The space looked completely transformed. New sensory equipment filled one corner. Interactive learning screens lined another wall. Parents who had spent months waiting for appointments wiped away grateful tears as they toured the room. Emma quietly stepped back, allowing families to celebrate together. She believed whoever had made the donation deserved sincere gratitude, even if they chose to remain invisible. Less than a mile away, Luca Moretti reviewed security updates inside a private office overlooking the Hudson River. The report about Emma rested unopened beside his coffee. He had asked for only one thing: confirmation that she remained safe. Instead, the folder contained photographs from several different days, documenting every routine she followed. He closed it almost immediately. The security director looked confused. "You requested protection. Protection does not require invading someone's life." His voice never rose. Yet everyone in the room understood the conversation had ended. The folder disappeared without another word. Luca walked toward the window, watching ferries carve white trails across the dark water below. He had spent years believing distance solved every problem. Now distance had become the one decision he questioned most. Back at the clinic, Emma received an unexpected phone call shortly before her afternoon appointments began. The Community Outreach Center wanted to thank the anonymous donor publicly during a small charity reception later that week. Several local therapists had been invited because the expanded program would benefit children throughout the neighborhood. Emma politely accepted, assuming it would simply be another fundraising event with speeches, volunteers, and local business owners. She had no reason to believe anything unusual waited there. As evening approached, she left work carrying a folder of therapy plans she intended to finish at home. The sidewalks glowed beneath rows of golden streetlights while restaurants filled with conversations drifting through open doors. She paused outside a neighborhood florist after noticing an elderly woman struggling to carry a large arrangement toward a nearby assisted living residence. Without hesitation, Emma offered to help. Together they walked several blocks, laughing as the wind repeatedly threatened to steal loose ribbons from the bouquet. The woman explained that the flowers were for her husband's birthday. He no longer remembered many names, but he still smiled whenever he saw white lilies. Emma listened with genuine warmth before wishing her a beautiful evening. She turned back toward the subway with lighter steps than before. Across the street, a black SUV remained parked beneath bare winter trees. Luca had just finished another meeting nearby when he noticed Emma again, this time carrying flowers that clearly did not belong to her. He watched the elderly woman embrace Emma before entering the residence. "She always stops," his driver observed quietly. Luca nodded almost to himself. Because she still believes people deserve to be seen. Neither man noticed another vehicle parked farther down the block. Its driver lowered a camera after taking several photographs of Emma speaking with the elderly woman. The images were immediately transmitted to the same unidentified client who had requested surveillance days earlier. At that exact moment, inside a quiet office on the opposite side of Manhattan, someone compared the newest photographs with earlier reports before writing one additional sentence across the top of the file. "She has become connected to him. Confirm the nature of the relationship." Emma remained completely unaware of any of it. She descended the subway stairs, humming softly to herself, thinking only about tomorrow's therapy sessions and the charity reception later that week. She believed the anonymous donor had changed the lives of countless children without asking for recognition. She did not yet realize that fate was slowly arranging another meeting, one that would force two completely different worlds to stand in the same room, while the unanswered questions surrounding the stranger from the storm grew impossible for either of them to ignore. Thursday evening settled over Manhattan beneath a sky painted with deep shades of blue and silver, the kind of winter twilight that made every office tower glow like a lantern against the approaching night. Emma Reynolds stood outside the charity venue for a brief moment before stepping through the revolving doors, smoothing the sleeve of her simple navy dress and quietly reminding herself that she was only there to represent the rehabilitation clinic. The grand ballroom felt like another world entirely. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while soft piano music floated through conversations between philanthropists, doctors, educators, and business leaders. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared hors d'oeuvre. Emma accepted a glass of sparkling water more to have something to hold than because she wanted a drink. Elegant events had never been her comfort zone. She preferred therapy rooms filled with finger paint and children's laughter over rooms where every conversation sounded carefully rehearsed. Even so, she smiled warmly whenever another guest introduced themselves or asked about the clinic's new pediatric program. She spoke passionately about the children instead of the equipment, explaining how early intervention changed lives long before expensive technology ever could. Several donors listened with genuine interest, surprised by how naturally she described every small success as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. Less than 10 minutes later, the ballroom gradually became quieter, conversations slowed, heads turned toward the main entrance almost in perfect unison. Emma noticed the shift before she understood the reason. A small group of impeccably dressed men entered together, each wearing tailored dark suits that attracted respectful nods from people throughout the room. At the center walked Luca Moretti. He carried himself with effortless composure, acknowledging greetings with quiet confidence rather than theatrical displays of importance. Emma felt genuine surprise spread across her face. She had never imagined the mysterious stranger from the storm belonged among New York's most influential guests. Their eyes met across the ballroom for only a brief second. Luca offered the smallest smile before continuing toward the event organizers waiting near the stage. Emma instinctively looked away, suddenly uncertain whether she should approach him at all. What she did not know was that nearly everyone else in the room recognized his name long before she ever learned it. Less than a minute later, the Master of Ceremonies welcomed guests and thanked the anonymous benefactor whose generosity had transformed pediatric rehabilitation services across the city. Emma expected another speech about charitable foundations. Instead, the presenter smiled toward Luca. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Mr. Luca Moretti for making this program possible." Applause filled the ballroom. Emma remained completely still. The realization settled over her slowly. The anonymous donor, the renovated therapy rooms, the new equipment, the expanded services, every child whose future had suddenly become brighter. It had all come from the same quiet man she had once covered with her own coat during a storm, because she believed no one should face the cold alone. Luca stepped onto the stage with remarkable calm. His remarks were brief. He spoke about opportunity, dignity, and giving children every chance to succeed regardless of circumstance. He never mentioned money, never mentioned recognition. When the applause ended, guests immediately gathered around him, eager for introductions and conversations. Emma considered slipping away before anyone noticed her. She suddenly felt out of place in a room filled with extraordinary wealth. Unfortunately for her, Luca noticed exactly where she stood. Excusing himself with quiet courtesy, he crossed the ballroom while dozens of curious eyes discreetly followed him. Emma watched him approach with growing uncertainty. "I did not expect to see you here," she admitted. "Neither did I," Luca replied with a faint smile, although something in his expression suggested otherwise. "How are the children enjoying the new therapy rooms?" Emma's surprise deepened. "You remembered. I remember everything that matters." Before she could answer, the clinic director hurried toward them with unmistakable excitement. "Emma, I see you have already met Mr. Moretti." She laughed nervously. "Only by accident." The director smiled. "Then allow me to formally thank you both." Mr. Moretti, your generosity has changed hundreds of lives. Emma, your patients have not stopped smiling all week. Luca looked toward Emma rather than accepting the praise himself. The rooms are only walls and equipment, he said quietly. People like Emma are the reason children heal. His words left her speechless. No wealthy executive had ever spoken about her work with such genuine respect. Across the ballroom, however, someone quietly photographed the conversation before disappearing behind another group of guests. The camera flash never appeared. The movement attracted no attention. Emma noticed nothing at all. But somewhere beyond the music, beyond the elegant speeches and warm applause, unseen pieces of a larger puzzle had finally begun to fit together, and before the evening ended, Emma Reynolds would discover that learning Luca Moretti's name was far easier than understanding the dangerous world hidden behind it. The applause slowly dissolved into quiet conversations as guests returned to small circles beneath the crystal chandeliers. Yet Emma Reynolds remained exactly where she stood, unable to reconcile the generous philanthropist everyone admired with the quiet stranger she had once found sitting alone beneath a broken bookstore awning. Luca Moretti seemed almost unchanged despite the attention surrounding him. He accepted handshakes with calm restraint, thanked donors without rehearsed charm, and listened more than he spoke. The contrast unsettled her. She had expected someone surrounded by wealth to carry himself with distance. Instead, he carried himself with discipline. There was a difference. The clinic director excused himself to greet another guest, leaving Emma and Luca standing beside one of the ballroom windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Snowflakes had begun drifting through the cold night air, soft enough to catch the reflections of thousands of city lights before disappearing into the darkness below. Emma smiled awkwardly. "You kept an enormous secret." Luca looked toward the window before answering. "Only because I wanted you to know me before you knew anything about my name." She laughed quietly. Most people would probably introduce themselves differently. Most people were not sitting under a leaking awning wearing someone else's coat. The memory dissolved much of the tension between them. Emma lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking again. "The children love the new therapy room. Some parents cried when they saw it." Luca did not immediately answer. Instead, he watched families walking several stories below through the softly falling snow. "That matters more than tonight." She studied his profile in silence. The ballroom lights reflected gently across the side of his face, revealing not pride but something closer to relief. Before she could ask another question, an elderly physician approached to congratulate Luca on the donation. Emma politely stepped aside, allowing them to speak privately, but fragments of their conversation drifted toward her. The doctor thanked him for supporting hospitals throughout the city over many years, mentioning programs Emma had never heard about. Luca accepted every compliment with visible discomfort before steering the conversation back toward the medical staff instead of himself. It was the second time that evening he had redirected praise away from his own generosity. Emma found herself respecting him even more because of it. Less than 30 feet away, hidden behind a decorative column, a man quietly lowered his phone after capturing another photograph of Luca and Emma speaking together. He slipped through a side exit before anyone noticed him. At that exact moment, another member of Luca's security team caught sight of the unfamiliar guest disappearing into the corridor. Without creating alarm inside the ballroom, he followed at a measured distance. Emma remained completely unaware. The evening continued with dinner and speeches celebrating community partnerships across New York. Emma found herself seated beside educators, pediatric specialists, and non-profit volunteers who all spoke passionately about helping children succeed despite difficult circumstances. Across the room, Luca participated in similar conversations, yet every so often his attention briefly returned toward Emma, as though confirming she remained comfortable inside an environment that clearly was not part of her everyday life. She noticed it once, then again. Neither of them acknowledged it. Near the end of the reception, guests gradually began collecting coats from the attended cloakroom. Emma wrapped the familiar midnight blue scarf around her neck before thanking the organizers and preparing to leave. As she reached the hotel entrance, she discovered heavy snow had begun falling much faster than expected. The sidewalks were already turning white. Taxi lines stretched halfway down the block while traffic barely moved through Midtown. Luca stepped outside only moments later. "You will be waiting a long time for a cab," he observed. Emma smiled. "That seems to be becoming a habit around you." A faint laugh escaped him, quiet but genuine. "Allow my driver to take you home." She hesitated immediately. I appreciate the offer, but I cannot ask you to do that. You are not asking. His tone remained calm rather than persuasive. The roads are getting worse and your neighborhood is already under a winter weather advisory. Emma looked toward the growing line of impatient guests searching for transportation. Accepting help still felt uncomfortable. She had spent most of her adult life solving problems without depending on anyone else. Seeing her uncertainty, Luca simply added, You once walked home through a storm because you refused to leave another person in the cold. Please allow me the opportunity to return that kindness properly. She finally nodded. Thank you. The black SUV rolled quietly to the curb as snow continued falling beneath the glow of city lights. Emma believed she was simply accepting a safe ride home from a generous stranger whose life had unexpectedly crossed hers once again. What she did not know was that less than 2 blocks away, someone watching from another parked vehicle quietly started an engine and pulled into traffic the very moment Luca's SUV began moving through the snowy streets of Manhattan. The black SUV moved smoothly through snow-covered streets while Manhattan drifted past in quiet shades of silver and gold. Warm air filled the cabin, carrying the faint scent of cedar and fresh leather instead of expensive cologne or polished luxury. Emma Reynolds sat beside the window watching delicate snowflakes disappear against the glass, suddenly aware of how different the city looked when she was not rushing from one responsibility to the next. Luca Moretti remained across from her, giving her enough space to feel comfortable rather than observed. For several blocks neither of them spoke. The silence never became awkward. It felt calm, almost unexpected, inside a city that rarely stopped making noise. Finally, Emma smiled. This is probably the first time I have ever accepted a ride from someone I barely know. Luca returned the smile with quiet honesty. I suppose that means I should finally earn your trust properly. She looked toward him with genuine curiosity. Can I ask you something? You may ask anything. Why did you remember me? The question lingered between them longer than either expected. Outside, traffic slowed as snow continued covering parked cars and bare tree branches. Luca answered carefully. Because most people looked through me that night. You looked at me. Emma frowned slightly. Anyone would have done the same. He gently shook his head. No. Most people had reasons not to stop. They were cold, they were busy, they were afraid. You stopped anyway. She looked down at the scarf wrapped around her hands. I only saw someone who needed help. Luca's voice became almost reflective. Exactly. The driver quietly focused on the road while city lights drifted across the windshield. Less than half a mile behind them, another dark sedan remained several cars back, never drawing attention, never attempting to pass. Inside, a man spoke softly into a wireless earpiece. They are together now. No further instructions came. Back inside the SUV, Emma noticed a framed photograph resting inside a small compartment near the rear console. It showed several children standing in front of a newly renovated community center, smiling proudly while holding colorful paintings. Luca noticed her glance. That project opened 3 years ago. She looked at him again. You support more than hospitals. Whenever I can. Why keep all of it anonymous? Luca watched snow gathering along the edges of the sidewalk before answering. Gratitude changes when people know your name. I prefer honest reactions. Emma considered his words quietly. They sounded less like the philosophy of a businessman and more like someone who had learned difficult lessons long ago. The SUV stopped briefly at a red light overlooking Bryant Park, now transformed into a peaceful blanket of white. Families crossed the square carrying shopping bags while children laughed as they attempted to catch snowflakes on their gloves. Emma smiled at the scene. My patients would love this weather. Do you ever stop working? Luca asked gently. She laughed. Not very often. Why? Because every child deserves someone who believes they will improve before they believe it themselves. Luca remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered almost to himself. Emma looked toward him. I do not think it is rare. I think people become too busy to notice they still have it. Her answer stayed with him longer than she realized. The SUV eventually turned onto the quieter street leading toward her apartment building. Snow muffled every sound until even the city seemed to whisper instead of roar. As the vehicle slowed near the entrance, Emma gathered her bag and looked toward Luca with sincere gratitude. Thank you for tonight, not just for the ride, for everything you have done for the clinic. Luca nodded once. The children have already thanked me by using those rooms. She reached for the door before owe you coffee. A faint smile appeared across his face. I believe I owe you a coat, she laughed softly. Fair enough. Before either of them could say another word, Luca's phone vibrated quietly. He glanced at the screen. The warmth in his expression disappeared almost instantly, replaced by calm concentration. He did not answer the call. He simply silenced it and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Emma noticed the change without understanding it. "Everything all right?" He looked back toward her, the gentle expression returning just enough to reassure her. "Just work." She accepted the explanation because she had no reason not to. After thanking the driver, she stepped into the softly falling snow and walked toward her apartment entrance. She turned once before disappearing inside, offering a small wave that Luca returned through the window. Only after the building door closed behind her did another vehicle quietly roll past the intersection without stopping. Inside, the unidentified observer lowered a camera after capturing one final photograph of Emma leaving Luca's SUV. At that exact moment, Luca finally answered the missed call. He listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the apartment building across the street. When the conversation ended, he spoke only one sentence. "Bring me every file you have on whoever has been watching her tonight." The city looked almost untouched beneath the fresh snow the following morning, as if the night had quietly erased every hurried footprint from the sidewalks. Emma Reynolds unlocked the rehabilitation clinic before sunrise, balancing a paper bag of homemade blueberry muffins she had baked for the staff returning home from the charity reception. She felt unusually light despite sleeping only a few hours. The evening kept replaying in quiet fragments inside her mind. The elegant ballroom, the children whose lives had changed because of one anonymous decision, the surprising realization that Luca Moretti preferred speaking about hope rather than himself. She reminded herself not to build stories around people she barely knew. Even so, she caught herself smiling more than once while arranging therapy supplies before the first patients arrived. The morning quickly filled with familiar sounds. Tiny footsteps echoed through colorful hallways. Parents exchanged hopeful conversations in the waiting room. One little boy proudly completed an entire speech exercise without looking toward his mother for reassurance. Emma celebrated the achievement with genuine excitement, kneeling to his eye level while everyone applauded. Across the room, another therapist quietly whispered that the new equipment had already shortened treatment times for several children. Emma silently thanked the anonymous generosity that had made moments like these possible, although now she knew exactly whose name had never appeared on the donation plaque. Less than 2 miles away, Luca Moretti sat inside a private conference room where no financial reports rested on the table. Instead, several photographs had been arranged in careful order. Every image showed the same unknown man observing Emma from different locations over the previous week. None of the photographs suggested immediate danger. That uncertainty concerned Luca more than certainty would have. His chief of security spoke calmly. "The investigator belongs to a licensed private intelligence firm. We traced the contract through 2 shell companies before the trail disappeared. We still do not know the client." "No." The older man hesitated before continuing. "We also confirmed that Emma has never spoken to him. He has maintained distance the entire time." Luca nodded once. "Keep it that way. Do you want us to confront him?" Luca answered immediately. "Not unless he gives us a reason." His response surprised everyone in the room. They expected decisive action. Instead, he chose restraint. After the meeting ended, Luca remained alone for several minutes looking toward the skyline, where sunlight reflected across frozen rooftops. He understood something his advisors did not. Emma had offered kindness freely because she believed people deserved dignity, not because someone forced the world into submission for her. If he responded carelessly now, he would become exactly the kind of powerful man she had spent her life avoiding. Meanwhile, Emma spent her lunch break organizing donated books for the children's reading corner when the clinic receptionist approached carrying a small envelope. "This arrived by courier," she said. "No return address again." Emma accepted it with a puzzled smile. The elegant handwriting immediately looked familiar. Inside rested a single ticket to the Natural History Museum's special evening exhibit supporting pediatric education, accompanied by one handwritten sentence. "Some children learn best by seeing the impossible become real." She stared at the note for several seconds before quietly folding it into her wallet beside the others. There was still no signature. None was necessary anymore. The museum had partnered with the rehabilitation program for years, offering sensory-friendly educational evenings for children recovering from long hospital stays. Whoever sent the invitation understood exactly what mattered to her. She decided she would use the ticket to your upcoming community event, not for herself alone, but alongside several families from the clinic who had also been invited. As the afternoon ended, gentle snow began falling once again. Emma wrapped the familiar midnight blue scarf around her neck before walking toward the subway with two young patients and their parents who happened to be traveling in the same direction. They laughed together while trying to catch snowflakes on their gloves, turning an ordinary walk into another happy memory. Across the street, hidden behind tinted windows, the unidentified investigator quietly lowered his camera instead of taking another photograph. He watched the children surrounding Emma with complete confusion, as though the report he had been hired to build no longer matched the woman standing before him. Several minutes later, he made a brief phone call. "Everything we found confirms the same conclusion," he said quietly. "She has no connection to his business. She is exactly who she appears to be." The response on the other end lasted only a few seconds before the line disconnected. At almost that exact moment, Luca received a separate message from his own security team confirming the investigator had temporarily suspended surveillance. He looked once more toward the photograph of Emma, laughing with the children outside the clinic. For the first time in many years, relief outweighed suspicion. Unfortunately, neither of them realized that the investigation had never truly been about Emma at all. She had simply become the unexpected bridge leading someone much closer to the one person they had been trying to understand from the very beginning. The museum's special evening program filled the grand exhibition hall with an atmosphere unlike any ordinary fundraiser. Instead of formal speeches and business conversations, the building echoed with children's laughter, curious questions, and the quiet excitement that came from discovering something extraordinary. Giant dinosaur skeletons stretched toward the glass ceiling while soft blue lighting transformed the galleries into places that felt almost dreamlike. Emma Reynolds arrived with several families from the rehabilitation clinic, helping young patients navigate the exhibits at their own pace. Some children moved carefully with walkers or braces, others spoke only in whispers. Inside those walls, none of those differences mattered. Every child looked upward with exactly the same wonder. Emma watched one little girl place both hands against the glass surrounding a collection of glowing minerals, her eyes reflecting colors that seemed almost magical. Moments like that reminded Emma why education and healing belonged together. Across the museum, Luca Moretti entered through a quieter side entrance accompanied by only one longtime associate, instead of the larger security detail that usually surrounded him. The evening had been organized to celebrate the new partnership supporting pediatric rehabilitation, and he intended to observe rather than become the center of attention. He paused near the balcony overlooking the main gallery when he noticed Emma kneeling beside a young boy who seemed frightened by the enormous model of a prehistoric sea creature suspended above the room. She smiled, pointed toward another display, and quietly transformed fear into curiosity with nothing more than patience and gentle encouragement. The boy laughed before running toward the interactive exhibit with renewed confidence. Luca watched the exchange without interrupting. His associate spoke softly. The reports never captured this. Reports rarely capture character. Later that evening, museum staff invited several children to participate in a private astronomy presentation beneath the planetarium dome. Emma helped guide the group inside, while parents followed behind with grateful expressions. The lights slowly dimmed until thousands of stars appeared across the curved ceiling. Young voices filled the darkness with amazement as constellations drifted overhead. Emma found herself standing beside Luca almost by accident near the back of the room. Neither wanted to disturb the children by speaking loudly. "Thank you for the ticket," she whispered. Luca nodded gently. "I hoped you would bring them." She smiled toward the children instead of looking at him. "They will remember this for years." "So will I," he answered quietly. The stars continued moving above them while the narrator described distant galaxies and worlds beyond imagination. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them spoke again. They simply watched the children pointing excitedly toward the artificial night sky. Emma realized something unexpected. Whenever Luca stood near children, his expression softened in ways she had never seen during formal events or business conversations. Whatever responsibilities waited outside these walls seemed to disappear, if only briefly. As the presentation ended, parents thanked museum volunteers before gathering coats and backpacks. One little boy from the clinic unexpectedly ran toward Luca holding a folded drawing he had colored during the evening. "This is for you," he said proudly. Luca accepted the paper with genuine surprise. It showed a simple picture of a dinosaur standing beside a hospital surrounded by smiling children. Across the top, written in careful block letters, the boy had added one sentence: "Thank you for helping my friends." Luca looked at the drawing for several silent seconds before kneeling to the child's height. "I will keep this," he promised. "Always." Emma witnessed the exchange from only a few feet away. Nothing about it appeared rehearsed. Nothing looked performed for public attention. She suddenly understood why so many hospitals, schools, and community programs quietly carried his support without displaying his name. The kindness was real. At that exact moment, across the museum entrance, the unidentified investigator stood beside a middle-aged woman dressed in an understated business suit. She studied the families leaving the event before quietly closing the final report. "You were right," the investigator admitted. "She is not connected to his world." The woman looked through the glass doors toward Emma and Luca, speaking briefly with grateful parents. "No," she replied calmly. "She reminds him of the person he wanted to become before power convinced him that compassion was weakness." Without another word, she handed the investigator an envelope containing his final payment. "Our work here is finished." They disappeared into the snowy Manhattan evening without approaching either of them again. Emma never saw them leave. Neither did Luca. As the museum lights reflected across fresh snow outside, the last unanswered mystery quietly came to an end, while something far more important had already begun. For the first time since that stormy night beneath the broken bookstore awning, neither of them was wondering who the other truly was anymore. Instead, they had both begun asking a much quieter question. What kind of future could grow from one small act of kindness that neither of them had ever expected to remember for the rest of their lives? Winter settled comfortably over New York during the following week, wrapping the city in crisp mornings, glowing sunsets, and quiet evenings that seemed to encourage people to slow down for just a little while. Emma Reynolds returned to the familiar rhythm of the rehabilitation clinic, but something inside her had changed in ways she could not fully explain. She still arrived before sunrise. She still celebrated every small victory with her young patients as though it were the greatest achievement imaginable. Yet now, every time she walked through the therapy room filled with equipment that had once existed only in hopeful conversations, she remembered the man who had quietly transformed those dreams into reality without expecting applause. The anonymous generosity was anonymous no longer, but the humility behind it remained exactly the same. One afternoon, the clinic director gathered the staff with unexpected news. The pediatric outreach program had received enough long-term funding to guarantee several additional years of treatment for families who otherwise could not afford specialized care. Parents waiting in the lobby embraced one another while children clapped without fully understanding why the adults around them suddenly looked so emotional. Emma watched the celebration from the doorway, her heart quietly full. She thought about every little hand she had held through difficult therapy sessions and every frightened child who would now receive help before hope had the chance to disappear. Across the city, Luca Moretti stood inside another boardroom surrounded by people discussing investments, expansion plans, and financial projections. Their voices blended into a distant background while his attention rested on the simple drawing the little boy had given him at the museum. It had been carefully framed instead of locked inside a private office. One executive noticed it and smiled. "It is unusual to see something like that in a room where billion-dollar decisions are made," Luca answered without hesitation. "It reminds me why those decisions matter." The room fell respectfully silent. Nobody questioned him again. Later that afternoon, Luca quietly left the meeting earlier than expected and asked his driver to stop several blocks away from the rehabilitation clinic. He chose to walk the remaining distance alone beneath rows of bare winter trees. Children were leaving for the day, waving excitedly to parents waiting outside with warm scarves and steaming cups of coffee. Emma stood near the entrance, helping one little girl zip her bright red coat before kneeling to tie the child's loose bootlace. The girl's mother thanked her with tears in her eyes, explaining that her daughter had spoken her first complete sentence only days earlier. Emma simply smiled and congratulated the little girl as though she had just won an Olympic medal. She never noticed Luca standing quietly across the street until the families had all gone home. He crossed only after the sidewalk became peaceful again. You always wait until everyone else leaves, Emma observed with a gentle smile. Because they deserve your attention first, Luca replied. They began walking slowly through the nearby park where fresh snow still rested across empty benches and winding paths. There was no need for formal conversation anymore. Silence between them had become comfortable rather than uncertain. Emma eventually looked toward him. Can I ask you something honestly? Always. Why did one stranger's kindness stay with you when you have probably met thousands of people? Luca looked toward the frozen pond reflecting the pale afternoon sky before answering. Because I spent years believing the world only respected power. Then one night someone offered compassion to a man who appeared to have nothing worth offering in return. You reminded me that there are still things money cannot purchase. Emma lowered her eyes for a moment. My parents used to tell me that kindness only counts when there is nothing to gain from it. Luca smiled softly. Then they raised an extraordinary daughter. She laughed quietly, embarrassed by the compliment. I am just a therapist. No, he said gently. You are someone who changes the direction of other people's lives without realizing it. They reached the same neighborhood where weeks earlier the storm had first brought their paths together. The old bookstore still stood beneath its repaired awning, now dry beneath clear winter skies. Emma stopped walking and looked toward the place where everything had begun. It looks different without the rain, she whispered. Luca nodded. Everything does. A peaceful silence settled between them while afternoon sunlight reflected across clean sidewalks that had once been covered by rushing water. Neither of them needed to revisit every detail of that night because both already understood its meaning. One ordinary decision had quietly rewritten two completely different lives. As they resumed walking side by side beneath the clear winter sky, neither noticed how naturally the distance between them had disappeared, leaving behind only quiet conversation, shared purpose, and the unmistakable feeling that sometimes the strongest foundations were built not from grand promises, but from the smallest moments of compassion offered without expecting anything in return. Spring arrived quietly, almost without permission. The last traces of winter disappeared from Manhattan's sidewalks as trees along the avenues exchanged bare branches for fresh green leaves, and sunlight lingered just a little longer every evening. Emma Reynolds often thought about how seasons changed the city without asking anyone for approval. Healing worked the same way. It rarely happened all at once. It happened one small moment at a time until one day people realized life no longer looked the way it once had. The rehabilitation clinic had become brighter in more ways than one. Children who had spent months learning to trust their own bodies now raced through therapy exercises with confidence. Parents who once arrived carrying fear now arrived carrying hope. Every colorful room echoed with laughter that had become possible because someone had believed those children deserved a future before they ever met them. Emma never stopped being grateful for that. One sunny Friday afternoon, the clinic hosted an open house celebrating the first successful year of the expanded pediatric program. Families returned with homemade desserts, handwritten thank you cards, and photographs showing milestones that once seemed impossible. A little girl who had struggled to speak now proudly welcomed every guest by name. A young boy who had once feared every staircase climbed one beside the playground without looking back. Emma watched quietly from the courtyard, realizing the greatest reward had never been recognition. It had always been watching children discover confidence they never believed they could possess. Luca Moretti arrived without photographers, without announcements, and without expecting anyone to notice him. He wore the same quiet composure that had first caught Emma's attention beneath the bookstore awning months earlier, but now something inside him had unmistakably changed. He no longer stood apart from the celebration. Parents recognized him. Volunteers greeted him warmly. Children waved as though he had always belonged there. One little boy proudly dragged him toward the reading corner to show him a bookshelf filled with stories purchased through the new program. Luca listened with complete attention, kneeling beside every child who wanted to explain a drawing, a toy, or a dream for the future. Emma watched from across the courtyard with a smile that reached her eyes. The distance that had once existed between their worlds no longer felt impossible. It had simply become irrelevant. Later that afternoon, after the families returned home and volunteers finished folding tables beneath the warm sunlight, Emma and Luca walked together through the small community garden beside the clinic. Flowers had begun blooming along narrow stone paths where children often played during therapy breaks. Birds filled the quiet afternoon with gentle songs that replaced the distant sounds of city traffic. They stopped beside a young maple tree planted earlier that morning by several patients to celebrate the anniversary of the program. A small plaque rested beneath it. It did not mention Luca's name. It did not mention donations or financial support. Instead, it carried a simple sentence chosen by the children themselves: kindness helps people grow. Emma read the words twice before looking toward Luca. That might be the most honest dedication I have ever seen. Luca smiled softly. It is also the most accurate. She laughed. You still prefer staying anonymous. Sometimes he looked toward the children playing beyond the garden fence, but not with the people who matter. Emma reached into her bag and carefully unfolded 2 pieces of paper that had traveled with her for months. The first was the handwritten note thanking her for the coat. The second was the warning asking her to be careful walking home after dark. She placed both into his hands. I thought you should have these back. Luca studied the notes before gently shaking his head. No, they belong to the person who changed the reason they were written. Emma looked at him with quiet understanding. You know, I almost walked past that bookstore. I know, I was tired. I almost convinced myself someone else would stop. Luca's voice remained calm, but warmer than she had ever heard it. The remarkable thing is that someone else never did. They stood together beneath the afternoon sunlight, saying nothing more for a while. There was no need for grand declarations, no dramatic promises. Their story had never been built on extraordinary speeches. It had been built on ordinary choices repeated with extraordinary consistency. Compassion instead of indifference, patience instead of pride, quiet generosity instead of recognition. As Emma looked across the courtyard, she noticed a young volunteer removing her own jacket to wrap it around a little boy who had begun shivering in the afternoon breeze while his mother searched for the car. The child smiled with grateful surprise. Emma instinctively smiled back. Luca followed her gaze and quietly understood the deeper meaning without either of them speaking. Months earlier, one woman had offered warmth to a stranger during a storm, believing the moment would disappear with the rain. Instead, that single act of kindness had echoed through hospitals, classrooms, families, friendships, and finally 2 lives that neither fate nor wealth could have brought together any other way. The city continued moving beyond the garden exactly as it always had, filled with millions of strangers crossing paths every day. Most would never meet again. But sometimes, on the rarest occasions, one small decision made in silence became the beginning of everything. And long after the storm had passed, what remained was never the memory of the rain. It was the memory of the person who chose to stand beside someone else until the sky became clear.